Thank you so much for coming today. I've, for 27 years, I've been having fun engaging people in learning about plants outdoors. So it's given a lot of people a chance to spend time outside on a day like today, and they get quite addicted to the idea. So let's have a look at what we've learned over that time. This is all the science of phenology. So phenology comes from the Greek to show or to appear. So it would be the science of appearances. When do the birds appear in the spring? When do the first flowers appear in the spring? When do the caribou migrate in the north? All kinds of biological events fall into phenology. Many people who work in this field, however, focus on flowers and blooming of flowers because plants are very convenient in that they don't fly away or run away. You can go back the next year and your perennial plant will still be there. So here I'm going to introduce two of the main actors in the play today. We have prairie crocus on the left and aspen poplar. Aspen comes in boys and girls, and we watch the boys, the male trees. They put out these little catkins in the spring like little pussy willows, and then their pink pollen sacs open and shed pollen, so that's what we call first bloom. This science goes back a long, long way to Rome and China, thousands of years ago, where this data was written down to form farmers' calendars, to advise the farmers on the best time to plant in the spring and to time their activities. And there are many uses for the information, which I will talk about. Now, this phenology is used here in Canada as part of Alberta Plant Watch and Canada Plant Watch. And this is a program which involves Nature Canada. Environment Canada has now stepped aside and given the program to Ottawa U. I will discuss that a little bit later. And then coordinators in all the provinces and territories. And it involves Canadians of all ages, from students of all ages, I guess you could call them, citizen science students. And it's very useful for tracking the effects of climate change. And I think one of the biggest benefits in terms of the environment is that people get more and more interested in nature as they observe. So it does raise awareness of science and climate warming as well. And what do the scientists do? So it's really pretty simple. You get the information on the web, or you get it from me, and you just go and pick one of 25 plants in Alberta that's close to your home, or more if you have time, and you write down when they bloom, first and mid-bloom dates. For some of the trees we track leafing out, and just write it down either on paper or send it via the web or via email. So that's how people report the data, and it's highly valuable information. And the whole season starts here in Alberta with this plant. Is there anyone here who either lives on a farm or did live on a farm at one time? A couple people did live on a farm. You live close to a farm. Anyway, prairie crocus is certainly a plant that you will be the first thing. It was a harbinger of spring. I used to get a lot of phone calls from people, where can I go find crocuses near Edmonton? So if you actually drive out Highway 14, the railway on the way to Riley often gets burned, and crocuses like areas where the competing grasses are burned away, so that is one excellent place to find them. Out on the Enoch Reserve as well, if you get permission, that's a great place to find crocuses. So they're definitely around the city. But the main trick in this whole story is that temperature is the driver. So if the winter is cold, and the spring is cold, then everything happens late, like this year. You know, April, it snowed almost every weekend in April, and things just waited and waited. And then bingo, the big warm up, and now everything's happened at once. Even the leaves have come out on the trees. So temperature is the driver, and it's not just a driver for spring plants here in the temperate zone, it also drives the insect development. So because you've got the plants and the insects developing in a predictable sequence every spring, you can use that information to help you in many things, in agriculture, in forestry. The information is very useful for predicting when a certain insect will be at its most vulnerable tiny stage in your crop or in your forest, so it can be treated with a minimal amount of control. So crop protection is one way to use it. But there's many, many other ways. In forestry, you can predict when to collect seeds. Say you're studying or you want to go take photographs in the mountains. Now this data can help you go at the right time to catch the majority of plants that you want to catch in flower. It's useful in climate change, I'll talk about that a bit later, or if you have allergies. In Italy this data is used mainly for allergies because again the sequence of pollen is pretty predictable and you can predict using the temperature accumulation when exactly that pollen, say you're allergic to birch or to juniper or other plants, you can predict when that allergy will be an issue for you and you can go on holiday. If you're interested in wildlife, say you're a hunter or you're a wildlife manager, you may wish to know if it's an early spring or a late spring, because in the early springs in Alberta, the female deer, the does, get lots of good nutrition early in the year and their fawns are very successful. In years where the spring is really late and they just can't get that green stuff to eat early, then they're much less successful and you have fewer fawns that make it to the fall. So if you're someone who's worried about the deer population, you want to keep track of whether it's an early or a late spring. I'm just working on a project now for the next few years looking at fire, because in Alberta the main danger season is just finishing. It starts when the snow melts and it ends when the trees green up. It's like the big green humidifier turning on. So with my data, I can predict several weeks ahead when green up will occur. And because a small fire in Alberta can cost $25 million, this is a big budget issue for the province to understand exactly when that window will be, so that things like Slave Lake don't happen again. If you are a gardener, and I know Bonnie here in the front in blue is a gardener, and I'm sure, is anybody else a gardener here? Oh my heavens, yes, okay. So here's some useful things. When the early blue violets appear, first seeds can go in the ground, that's lettuce, radishes. When the leaves come out, that's this week on Aspen, good time to plant potatoes. When Saskatoon hits full bloom, some farmers told me that that's when all your grain should be already in the ground, so it should be finished by then. And then when lilac starts to bloom, you can put your tomatoes outside. The risk of frost is really basically fast, but you know Alberta, you never want to be sure about that frost. Well, this is a fun one. Back in 1605, Samuel de Champlain arrived on the shore of Cape Cod, and he was told by the First Nations there that if he was going to stay and plant corn, then his corn should go in the ground on the day when the white oak leaf was the size of the red squirrel's footprint. That was the best day, because the soil was warm enough, the air was warm enough for that tree to have leaves that size, and you would get the best season for your corn. Now here, I've heard it said that when the lilac leaves are an inch long, that's when you plant corn in Alberta. So I don't know, does anybody plant corn here? No, okay, you do. Oh, good. It's never successful. You might try this, it might work. Because why wait till May 24th when you've got extra weeks? The ground should be warm enough. If you were here for a previous talk on climate change, you might have seen this graph already. It shows basically that the amount of atmospheric CO2 in this nice isolated place of Hawaii has increased very steadily since well before 1960, but this month we just hit 400 parts per million, so it's sort of inexorable increase courtesy of the fossil fuels that we are happily emitting. So warming goes hand in hand with that. This is a very busy graph. I'm just going to show you a couple of things. Here up in the northwest part of North America, that's where most of the warming is happening. So we're over 3 degrees in that area already of warming. Forest fires have jumped up in Canada since the 70s. There's really quite a bit of change going on. This is from a paper that I wrote back in 2000 showing the change in aspen pollen shed time in Alberta, in Edmonton City actually, over about 100 years. It has moved by 26 days. But in retrospect, some of that data is from the city, and the city has a heat island effect due to, again, glass, concrete, fossil fuel emissions and heating. So in a paper that I'm going to tell you about in a minute, we removed the effect of city. But there's definitely some warming going on. So this is the paper, Spring Flowering Response to Climate Change over the 70 years between 1936 and 2006, and you can find that in Bioscience. What we did is we looked at central parkland. So you'll see Edmonton in the top left there of the inset. And it is, that data is taken out of the data set so that we're not being confused by the warming that's happened in the city. So we looked at data for the whole central parkland. Now those little gray circles, the bigger the circle, the more phenology data there is for that location, so the more years of data. And then we also used weather from the 4 black weather stations to compare. And what we saw is that there's a big change in winter. Winter temperatures have increased quite dramatically. In fact, the bottom line there shows the average February temperatures over those 70 years, and they are changing at 0.75 degrees per decade, which translates to about 5 degrees change over 70 years, which is massive. But even more massive is the minimum temperatures, the nighttime temperatures. They've gone up by 6 degrees. So nights getting warmer, winters getting warmer, and that has definitely affected the plants. So what plant data did we have? 3 data sets. The first one starting from the federal government a long time ago, 1936 to 61, from Agriculture Canada. And they had observers in 3 stations in the prairies. I think it was Winnipeg, Swift Current, and Edmonton. And so they wanted to help wheat farmers, so they gathered observations on when the native plants were developing and used that to help in wheat production. So that's a useful data set. And then Dr. Charles Bird also ran a survey of naturalists for 10 years. So we have his data, and that was all with volunteers. And I don't know, has anybody here ever met Charles Bird? No, okay. He's a guy I admire a lot. He's a classic Renaissance naturalist. He's not only good at plant timing, he's an expert on plants, an expert on butterflies. He wrote the book Butterflies of Alberta. He understands all the moths and mosses as well. So anyway, if I could grow up like him, I'd be happy. So this is the survey that I've run since I picked up his survey. So he ran that survey and I sort of resurrected it 5 years later in 1987. And since then I've had usually between 100 and 200 observers, and we now have 25 plant species that people observe. So I use first bloom data from those 3 surveys. I'll just tell you a little bit about some of the plants and why we picked them. This is my buddy Aspen poplar here, and we track when the pollen first sheds, when it sheds about half of those catkins have shed, and then when the leaves first open. But how did we select these plants? Well, we wanted plants that were widespread, so they occur all across Alberta, fairly easy to observe, and they're easy to identify. Strawberries are usually easy because they have 3 leaves, and I think people know dandelions when they see them. That's not an issue. Lodgepole pine's a bit trickier. It is our provincial tree, but it's a very nice one because the pollen sheds really fast. So the events happen quickly. And a short bloom period, like I just said about that pine, things happen fast, and no look-alike species. I'm going to do a little test here. Can anybody identify this one? Oh, everyone's so shy. This is chokecherry. Now this is purple saxifrage. You're only going to see it up in the mountains in Alberta. And then that one is something that's going to bloom very soon, and it makes good fruit. Oh, very good. Saskatoon. And just another example, common purple lilac and dandelion are 2 species which are not native plants. They came from other places. Did you know they brought dandelion to North America as a food plant? It was brought by early settlers as a spring vegetable, and they put chicken wire around it to prevent the gophers from eating it. And then it spread everywhere. And I highly recommend eating dandelions. You will find you can just take the young plants before they flower, clean them, chop them up, stir fry the whole thing, roots and shoots, and the next spring when you look at a dandelion, your mouth will start to water. Your body is telling you, eat those dandelions. They are great. So first bloom and mid bloom. So this is the common purple lilac. So those are stages that we track. So for the analysis of the papers that I did, I basically used these 4 plants. So going across the top we have crocus, aspen, and chokecherry, and then along the bottom we have the Elaeagnus is wolf willow. Does anybody, have you ever smelled wolf willow? Heather says yes. Do you like the smell? You hate the smell? It's like cilantro. You either love it or you hate it. I had an observer who always carried a clothespin in his car so that he would be ready for flowering season, because he lived in Lethbridge. So that's wolf willow, and then Saskatoon, yarrow, and northern bedstraw. Those are the 4 plants that we track. Now here's a complicated graph, but it tells us some very interesting things. So I'm just going to move again over here. So again, years along the bottom, and day of year, oh look at this one, day of year when the first flowering happened. So red is poplar, is that true? No. Red is crocus, yellow is poplar. And you'll notice they do almost the same thing on the same day. So the neat thing that this graph shows is that flowering happens in a tidy sequence every spring. And some springs are early, like this one, 1981, and some springs are spectacularly late, like 2002. But we have poplar and crocus, Saskatoon, chokecherry, wolf willow, bedstraw, and yarrow, almost always in that sequence. So one plant can be used to help you figure out when another event later will happen within a year. This is, I'm not going to explain it thoroughly, but this is the temperature equivalent. So what we did is we mapped, say, 100 growing degree days for every year, and we saw when it happened. And you can see that the 2 graphs are pretty similar. The flowers are following the temperature buildup in the spring. We also tried to figure out other things that might be affecting bloom time. And we discovered that here in the central parkland over about 70 years, the snowpack has been decreasing. Does anybody remember years, 20, 30 years ago, when the snow used to be much deeper? Yeah, well, it definitely is. We've lost, let's see, the dark line on top is how much snow was there at the end of February in that central parkland area, and that has dropped every 10 years by 4 centimeters. So there's a lot less snow now. And this increasing drought that we have had in the central parkland, which basically started in the biggest El Nino year, 1998, that was the biggest year globally for El Nino. We've had drought ever since, and it has certainly caused some issues with our trees in the area. You may have noticed that birch trees in your neighborhood are not as happy or maybe even dead. I have been tracking certain aspen and balsam poplar along the edge of my neighborhood for 25 years now. And what I have found is that almost all the balsam poplars at the top of the ravine have died. Balsam poplar leaves have little stomata in them, which allow the oxygen to get out that the trees are making and allow the carbon dioxide to get in. But balsam poplar are unable to close those little breathing holes. So they just run out of water. The water keeps coming up the trunk and it just keeps coming out. So the top of the tree dies back and then eventually the whole tree goes. So these aspen are a lot more drought hardy, but we've lost a lot of those too. So I'm going to make a bit of a wild prediction here that in several decades we might start a transition from forest to prairie around this part, be more suitable for prairie grasses. Interesting. The things that climate warming will do. And what's been happening in frost in this area? Well, again, the bottom line is the last date when the frost was below 10 degrees. And then the top line is the last date when the frost was about 0 or below. So what we see here is that the frost is changing. The 0 degrees is changing at about 1 day per decade. But our plants, the early plants, poplar and crocus, are changing at 2 days per decade. So they are retreating towards winter much faster than the frost is moving. So it means that those early events are happening more and more in the period of hard spring frosts. And the effect of those frosts is that the flowers get killed and then there's no seeds produced. And with climate warming, if anything, we're going to want plants to have lots of seeds so they can move as fast as their climate zones are shifting north. So, something to think about. Another paper here, I summarized the experiences with plant phenology to create recommendations for people who wanted to set up a similar survey in phenology. So I looked at quality of the data and learned about the observers. The observers that have been part of Plant Watch have been a range of people from, some of them were botanists and scientists, most of them were naturalists or gardeners. I had fire tower watchers. I've had, one of the most exciting is the volunteer observers of the Atmospheric Environment Service, so the weather watchers, also watching plants, because then we get plant data and weather data from the same location. But really, traveling salesmen, ranchers, farmers, everyone has taken part in this. And these are where the observations have been, and the darker the circle, the longer people have sent information in from that spot. So you can see we have a pretty nice distribution of locations. Here's a map of the natural regions of Alberta, and the bright orange there, again, is the central parkland. And you can see that that's where most of the observations were from, up to 3,500 back in the peak of 1993. After that, I got interested in the National Plant Watch, and I also got busy writing my master's thesis. No, anyway, I have good excuses, but there wasn't a lot of promotion done. This is the average sequence for the whole province. So it took the data for 20 years, up to 87 to 2006, and did an average. So what it does is it just shows you the sequence. So early blue violet is usually 2 days after dandelion, and Saskatoon is followed 3 days later by wild strawberry. So those kinds of relationships generally hold, but they do vary a lot from year to year. So say prairie crocus and aspen poplar are the most changeable at the start of the season. They can change by a month, from a very early spring to a very late spring. So how long do observers participate? This shows numbers of observers on the y-axis. So most people just report for a year, and the next biggest group is for 2 years. But by looking at the log graphs here, we can see that people who reported over 9 years, the middle graph, they actually reported more observations. More than half of our observations. And the bottom graph was just a quality check. We looked at how good is the data from people who have stayed with the program 9 years. And we found that those people's data was definitely more accurate, but not a whole lot more accurate. So we're getting good data even from people who just report for a year and then move on to another project. So I find that very inspiring. So 47,000 observations. I'm now putting in the last 6 years of observations, so we'll have well over 55,000. And really it does seem to highly suit some volunteers. And it really is an excellent way to track what's happening in nature. They've done studies where they've done huge experiments applying temperature, higher temperatures to whole areas of wild plants, higher CO2 levels, higher precipitation, and the results just don't match reality. So this is the best way to find out about what's actually happening on the landscape, to actually write it down. And the thing about phenology is it has to be written down. I mean, we have proxy data from pollen cores from lakes. They tell you about past climate. We can cut down trees and look at the tree rings. That tells you about past climate. But this has to be written down, otherwise there's no record that's available. Here in Edmonton, we're really lucky because we have lots of neat habitat. The river valley is full of forest. There's some native meadows. So the plant watch species are quite easy to find. This is what's happening right now. The aspen poplar trees have just put out their leaves. The balsam poplar are partway through. So they're looking a little droopy right now because it's been dry for weeks and weeks. But tonight it's going to start to rain. So those with the gardeners are going, yay, we get some rain. Other things that may have started already, has anybody seen any Saskatoons in bloom? You have already? Okay, that's great. I think coming across the LRT, I saw patches of white on the south-facing hill. They've started already. Excellent. Yeah, the last ones I checked, they were still in bud. But strawberry and early blue violet are also things that should be coming out soon. So if you decide you want to track, say, a Saskatoon or a patch of dandelions or a lilac bush or whatever, let me know and I will send you information. If you're involved with any school groups or Girl Guide groups or Scout groups, there's a wonderful teacher's guide on the www.PlantWatch site, and it has all the curriculum links for grades 5 to 8 math and science. So there's lots of neat exercises like getting the kids to add up the growing degrees every day and then predict when the first Saskatoon will pop into bloom. I also developed a wall chart that could be used in, say, Terwilliger Park. Post it, tag 5 Saskatoons, maybe put a map on the net saying this is where you find the Saskatoons, and people walking their dogs can just report bloom times of the plants that appeal to them. So that's available. The future for this program, Environment Canada in its wisdom decided to cut citizen science, this program, Nature Watch, 2 years ago, but they handed the webpage to Ottawa University, which has a new citizen science lab. So what they want to do is they want to run Frog Watch, Ice Watch, Plant Watch on smartphones. And the big bonus with that is you get the location, they can submit photographs. I think it has a lot of exciting possibilities. So in conclusion, there's lots of reasons to become a plant watcher if this interests you. I had one lady write me and say, I've lived on this ranch for 30 years and I've just discovered early blue violets. Suddenly she was seeing things that had been around her all the time, but because she was focusing, now wherever she goes, she's going to be spotting something she never knew existed. And someone else wrote me and said, thanks for the excuse to have fun and feel useful at the same time. So I think a lot of people use this to get away from their other duties and escape their computer perhaps, go enjoy nature. So thank you very much for coming. I also need to thank Dr. Hammond, who was my PhD supervisor. That ended in January. It's all done now. That was great. I've had over 650 volunteers in Alberta over time and many very talented assistants to help run this program.